What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. I'm excited for today's video. I'll confess, this is not an original idea to me. This video is inspired by similar videos I've seen done by other people, other therapists as well, answering some of the most frequently asked questions about the therapy profession, specifically asked to Google. I thought it could be interesting to see what kinds of questions folks are typing into Google searches about therapists, because probably those are reflecting some of the questions people have about therapists in general. Now, in order to do this video, I'm leveraging Google's auto-suggest feature in order to figure out what sorts of things folks are typing into Google searches. So I'm just starting by typing the phrase, "do therapist," and before clicking enter to do the search, I just see what items pop up in the suggestions in that drop-down menu, and that gives us a clue to what folks tend to be searching in Google searches related to do therapists. So as I type that in, the first search question that pops up is, do therapists have therapists? I'm just kind of imagining that somebody is asking this question as they're thinking about their therapist, like, does my therapist go to therapy? I wonder, let me Google it. Pretty much across the board, therapists are highly encouraged to seek out their own therapy pretty regularly throughout their therapist career. With that said, there's some nuance to this. One, we're not required to have therapists, so I know therapists who really just don't see therapists in like their entire career. That's up to someone's discretion whether they think that that's a wise choice or not. There's also quite a bit of nuance that comes with looking for a therapist when you're a therapist. One, the world of therapists is quite small, so first you have to branch outside of your existing networks, because maybe you're referring to other people, you're friends with therapists, they're colleagues, you went to school with them, all of those things, and so you kind of have to branch out. But even once you've branched outside of your existing networks to find a therapist, you also have to find a therapist who's a good fit for you. You want to find a therapist who has experience working with therapists. So that narrows the pool even more. And then because we're therapists, we always have opinions and preferences, so much more usually than the average person as far as what therapy is supposed to be like or what therapy we most appreciate. I mean, this is true across any field. I mean, if you're an expert painter and you're hiring someone to paint something for you, you might have a whole lot of opinions about how they're doing it because you know exactly what they're doing. So it tends to take quite a while to find a therapist that you feel like, yes, I finally found my person, here we go. And the next question that pops up in our Google auto-suggest search is, do therapists make good money? Oh my goodness, do people love asking this question. I remember when I was in college, there was kind of this perception from folks around me, other folks majoring psychology, just friends, that therapists just make like tons of money. The answer to this question is really, really nuanced. All of these questions are quite nuanced. I'll say from my perspective of the matter, most therapists on average are not making very good money. Now that phrase good money is super subjective, so I'll explain why I think that is. Now first, if you go on a search through Glassdoor or Indeed.com, you'll find that starting salaries for a lot of therapists can range widely, anywhere from like 40-something thousand a year all the way past 6 figures. I think the average salary that most licensed therapists makes, though, is somewhere in the like 70,000 a year ballpark range for a full-time therapist. Now, that might sound like pretty decent money. There are a lot of people who would love to make that much money who are making much less. But with that said, we have to factor in the amount of training and time delayed between starting to do your training to be a therapist and then actually making that salaried gig once you're fully licensed. For me, the entire process of undergrad, graduate school, and postdoc work was 10 years. So it takes a really long time to go from I want to be a therapist to I'm earning that income. And then when we factor in that the average therapist has 6 figures of student loan debt, well, if we could have just started 10 years sooner at almost any other job, we could have worked our way up, maybe earned less than that average $70K per year, but it still would have been more because we don't have any debt, and we could have been saving that money for those 10 years in my case that we were delaying making that income. All that to say, on average, most therapists don't make very good money from my perspective, but there is the potential to earn quite a bit of money. It just kind of depends on what career path you choose. I've spoken about this in different videos, so I'll link to something about that below. Okay, the next question is, do therapists take insurance? Again, it depends, but if the question is, can therapists accept insurance for therapy? absolutely, as a general broad concept, therapists can bill insurance for services. If you go through your insurance and they cover therapy services, you see a therapist who is on insurance panels that you're on, then you can pay a copay or something along those lines for your therapy that's far more affordable than if you paid for those therapy services out of pocket. With that said, not every therapist accepts insurance. Not every therapist who accepts insurance accepts your insurance, and not every insurance provider offers really great coverage for therapy services. Now, the next question is, do therapists diagnose? Which, broadly speaking, yes, therapists are equipped, qualified to diagnose mental health specific disorders. Now, as with all these questions, there can be more nuance to this, so maybe not every single therapist is qualified to diagnose every single item that's related to mental health. There's different types of specialties, and so some therapists may need to get kind of additional qualifications in order to diagnose certain items. But just as a broad sweeping question of whether we can diagnose, the answer is yes. The next question that pops up is, do therapists have to report crimes? Now, this one's a little bit tricky. As a broad sweeping answer, for crimes that have already happened, whether they happened yesterday or 20 years ago, we are not allowed to report those crimes. They are protected by confidentiality. I remember thinking this was so wild when I learned about this in graduate school. I thought, well, but surely if the crime is horrific enough, we should be required to report those, or at least allowed to, but they are generally protected by confidentiality, meaning we're not allowed to tell anybody about it. It's a secret that we have to keep safe. Now, before we dive further into this question, I just want to make sure I specify that I'm referring to the US. Particularly, each country might have its own rules that I'm honestly not even educated about. And also, state by state, we all have different laws covering the practice of therapy. And so whatever might apply in my state of California might be totally different in your state. So just be mindful of that. But there are some exceptions to confidentiality when it comes to reporting past crimes. Specifically, one that's pretty much across the board, I think across every single state, is if there is a crime related to child abuse, as well as usually elder abuse or dependent abuse. Even if it happened a long time ago, we can still report those if we think that the person who was abused back then might still have the potential to, be abused by the same person. If it's a child, if they're still under 18, then we still report that usually. Or if we have reason to believe that the abuser might still have access or close access to other folks that they could abuse, even if it happened a long time ago. But aside from these very specific exceptions, if somebody tells us that they committed a crime in the past, even if they killed someone yesterday and they tell us, we are not allowed to report that. Hello, it's Marie from the future, interrupting. While I'm editing this video, I realize I only addressed past crimes. So if it's regarding present or future crimes in particular, we generally still can't report intent to engage in a crime unless it has to do with harming someone, whether it's ourselves or somebody else, in which case we do have different duties to warn, or depending on the state that you live in, you have some follow through that you tend to do to report that. All right, back to the regular video. Okay, now for some of the less heavy-hitting topics that come up from our Google search question. Do therapists give advice? I like this question, and wouldn't it be nice if it was just such a simple yes or no question? I'll say, generally speaking, advice is not the primary method of treatment that therapists offer. Or another way of framing it is, if you're meeting with a therapist and all they're doing is giving advice, then what you're experiencing is probably not really therapy. What we're trying to do is advocate for the clients that we work with to be able to understand themselves, their needs, their decision making better, be better empowered in order to move forward, so that it's not just, hey, Dr. Marie, can you tell me what to do this week? I say, hey, do XYZ, you go off and do it, and now you're dependent on me giving you specific advice in order to keep moving forward. With all of that said, even though advice isn't the bedrock of the therapy work that we do, I would say for a lot of therapists, including myself, there are times where we give advice, and sometimes I'll give very specific advice. Generally, I reserve advice for situations that I find escalating to a level of crisis or urgency where somebody needs me to tell them what to do in order for them to be able to move towards safety, in order for them to get out of a dangerous situation. In those scenarios, I absolutely will give advice. The next question intrigues me. Do therapists work on weekends? It stands out to me that this is like question number 10 or something, and this auto suggest question, which means a lot of people are asking this question. Maybe people are looking it up because they're looking for a therapist who works on weekends because that's the only time they're free. Or maybe people are looking it up because it's therapists figuring out if they have to work on a weekend. Of course, as with every single question now, literally on this list, the answer is it depends. It depends either on where the therapist works. Of course, then it's whatever the business hours are of that place, or if they're working for themselves in private practice, setting their own schedule, it's up to the therapist. A lot of therapists do choose to work on weekends because for some clients, of course, it's much easier to schedule then. And naturally, a lot of therapists choose not to work on weekends because just like everyone else, we want to have our weekend. We may or may not work on the weekend. And the last question that pops up, at least as far as this drop down goes, is do therapists have patients or clients? For those of you who haven't been kind of versed in this kind of controversial topic, there are some really strong opinions about this. The medical model tends to use the word patient. So if you're going to see your doctor, they're treating you as a patient. And within the medical model, there's the sense that the doctor knows what to do. They can, diagnose your ailment or whatever reason it is that you're coming in. They can prescribe something. They can tell you what to do. And as long as you comply, it's going to fix it. And so a lot of people historically have mapped that term onto therapy work within the medical framework and to say, well, as therapists, we must be then working with patients. We're going to diagnose, we're going to prescribe, not medication, but we'll prescribe whatever sort of talk therapy, whatever sort of behavioral changes they might need. And as long as they implement those changes, they should get better. This is a very problematic point of view to see a medical model applied to the majority of therapy work. Not every client coming in feels like they have like an ailment that they're seeing a therapist for. It also promotes this kind of hierarchical power struggle where I, as the therapist, know what to do. I'm going to tell you what to do. There goes that question about the advice. And you just need to implement what I'm telling you to do in order for you to reach your goals. On the flip side, the term clients has more of a business, transactional nature behind it, which makes sense on the one hand because somebody's, in private practice, somebody's coming in, they're paying me money for a service. I'm going to see them as their therapist and support them. So they're my client. But also, there is something about the nature of therapy that has a very relational component to it. So personally, I use the word clients, but I'm aware that it's still problematic in some ways. It's complicated, as everything is. Everything that popped up felt so nuanced to me. I'm so aware that I just barely touched on the surface of answering these questions. So if you really are wondering the answer to one of these questions, please make sure you follow through and do your due process, rather than just relying on something I said in this video. But I still hope it was helpful to maybe bring some illumination, make you want to learn a little bit more about one of these things, or just be more mindful as you go into your work, whether it's as a therapist or as someone seeing a therapist. And before we close, I'd like to thank TherapyNotes.com for sponsoring this video. TherapyNotes is an all-encompassing practice management system. They got you covered in scheduling and notes and billing. They have a HIPAA-secure telehealth platform, which, by the way, is free for all users. So if you'd like to check out TherapyNotes, you can get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment just by clicking the link in the description of this video. Well, I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if there's a different kind of search phrase that you want me to try out next time instead of the do therapist phrase. I don't know, whatever it could be. I'd be interested to try this out for other phrases too. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.